One of the most important skills that a person can have in any type of academic debate is cross-examination. Now, cross-examination, not quite the same thing that you've seen from lawyer shows or, TV shows or movies about cops or even if going to court. It's not quite the same thing because this isn't just persistent badgering. What it is a chance for opponents to actually interact. See, most time you're just making speeches at each other. However, cross-examination is the one time in debate that, like boxers, you actually get to fight. You actually get to go back and forth with your opponent. And like boxing, a person who is skilled at cross-examination can truly win or lose a round within that questioning period. Good questioners are the ones who can actually ask those knockout questions. They're the ones who can set you up for good arguments later on, and that's what we'll be talking about here today. Now, there are two purposes of cross-examination: clarification and concession. Clarification is making sure that you have all the information that you can possibly need and that you heard your opponents correctly. And then you also have concession. Concession differs from clarification because concession is a matter of trying to get your opponent to admit things that maybe they don't want to admit because it's going to help your case later on. So with those two purposes in mind, let's look at clarification. Clarification is really if you're lost, if you're confused, if you don't know what your opponent said, because you want to make sure that you know exactly what your opponent said during their case, because that way you know exactly what you're going to argue against. Now, you may not have heard your opponent. Your opponent may have been speaking too quickly, you may think you misheard them, or you may just want to clarify just to be safe. All the same, you want to start out cross-examination by asking those clarifying questions, by making sure that you absolutely understand what your opponent said. You also want to go down a checklist. For instance, the significance, harms, inherency, topicality, solvency, the 5 stock issues of policy debate. Cross-ex is a time to establish these, because if your opponent does not have every item on its checklist, then they lose the round. And cross-ex is a good time to do that. Remember and think of cross-ex kind of like Jenga. You want to sit there and pull the pieces out, and hopefully you'll end up tumbling your opponent's case because you asked the right questions. In addition, though, to clarification, you also want to focus on the idea of concession. Concession is the idea of getting your opponent to admit evidence that you can use against them. Now, the absolute best evidence in any debate round does not come from any professor, any book, or any source. It's your opponent's own words, which is exactly why we Mirandize people. When people are arrested, we let them know that everything, what's the phrase? That everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Now, why do we let people know this when they're being arrested? Because we understand that a person's own words are the most damaging piece of evidence we could possibly have against them. So that's the important thing you're trying to go for. You're looking for evidence, but more importantly, you're looking for ammunition. You are looking for ways to attack your opponent using their own words. So now, where do you get this ammunition from? Well, you know exactly what you're going to argue. You already have your case prepped. So when you go in, you know what your opponent has to say, so you can quote them in support. So you already know the game plan that's going on. So use that in order to do what? To ask the right questions, to set your opponent up, so you can quote them in response and say, "Judge, remember when my opponent said this? This agrees with my points." Stick with the game plan. So cross-examination, it sounds complex, but it really comes down to two things: concession and clarification. If you can do those two things, then just like Muhammad Ali, you may be able to knock people out and get the winning round just in cross-examination.